Foreword to Friedrich Engels, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, by Jennifer Doyle. Our sexual lives unfold within the social systems into which we are born, and against which many of us struggle. Love, shame, beauty, these things are material expressions of those systems, as is a sense of family, race, and sex. The shape and direction of desire, its objects, the sense of what satisfaction is or whose desires matter, who gets to have or to be a family, what pleasures are good and attainable, what pleasures are forbidden and unspeakable. These modes of relation and systems of value are local and have histories. The aim of this book is to make you feel just this. Your life is a material expression of an evolving system that precedes you, that conjures and constitutes you. The son of wealthy textile manufacturers, Engels enjoyed the good life that fortune afforded him, shared his wealth, including famously to support Marx's writing, and mostly rebelled against the bourgeois values he was expected to embody. Scandalously for a man of his background, he had a long-term relationship with a working-class Irish woman, whom he met while working for one of his family's businesses in Manchester. Accounts of their relationship credit Mary Burns with guiding him through miserable corners of the city and providing him with insights necessary to the development of the condition of the working class in England, an incendiary work whose content and tone anticipate The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State. In an intentional rejection of bourgeois values, the two never married. One gets the impression, however, that this decision made things easier for Engels socially. Mary was by all accounts functionally illiterate and, one imagines with good reason, outspoken. He was devastated when she died suddenly at 40. She and Engels had been together 20 years. Marx's apparent indifference to his friend's grief is, according to biographical lore, the source of their one major argument. We know little about Mary Burns, despite her obvious importance. After she died, Engels took up with Mary's formidable sister Lizzie, who had lived with them and helped take care of the household. When Lizzie became Engels' partner, another Burns woman, Mary Ellen, a niece, moved into the house and took up Lizzie's work. I like to think that Engels chose to live not with a wife, but with women. This household was maintained at a slight remove from his public life, however. These women lived in a second home, and their relationship with Engels was sustained as an open secret. As becomes clear to readers of this text, Engels was drawn to the idea of worlds in which women enjoyed more sexual freedom, children were raised with many mothers, and social authority was shared and even, in important ways, centered on women. He participated in the whole-cloth critique of the institution of marriage and, in his work, echoed the position of feminists of the era, such as Victoria Woodhull, who condemned marriage as a state-sanctioned form of prostitution. Sexual life inhabits the margins of much of Marx's and Engels' work. The origin of private property, they write in the German ideology, lies in the family, where wife and children are the slaves of the husband. In Capital, sex difference quietly anchors Marx's elaborations on the division of labor. Quote, the distribution of labor within the family and the labor time expended by the individual members of the family are regulated by differences of age and sex. Unquote. Sex workers step forward as the embodiments of what capitalism does to the soul. Prostitution, we learn from the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, is only a specific expression of the general prostitution of the laborer. Unquote. Sex is a vanishing point in which we disappear into nature. The distinction between men and women operates as a powerful given. Quote, the relation of man to woman is the most natural relation of human being to human being. Unquote. It is, quote, the direct, natural, and necessary relation of person to person. Unquote. In the relationship of man to woman, man's relation to nature is immediately his relation to man, just as man's relation to man is immediately his relation to nature, his own natural function. Unquote. Concentrate on the language of sex/gender in Marxist literature and you might get dizzy. The division of the world of labor into production and reproduction is rooted in so-called natural distinctions between men and women. But the scaffolding for that binary narrative is remarkably brittle. In general, Marx and Engels' writings about gender difference is most compelling not where the gender binary stabilizes their thought, but where it crumbles and falls apart. Industrial capital poisons and rips open the family. This fact supplies much of the outrage that propels Engels' The Condition of the Working Class in England. There, in the stinking rack heap of that book's unrelenting inventory of human miseries, one finds a set of provocations about the family. Because their labor is systematically devalued, children are, on the whole, men, women and children are both more suited to operating factory machines and more desirable as workers. They cost less, they take up less space. Engels shares stories about women driven to work days after giving birth, leaking milk into their clothes, and babies fed laudanum, an opiate, to keep them quiet. As work for men dries up, they find themselves stuck at home, stewing in squalor and rage. This condition, he writes in prose that distills itself into sneering irony, unsexes the man and takes from the woman all womanliness, without being able to bestow upon the man true womanliness, or the woman true manliness. This condition, which degrades in the most shameful ways both sexes, and through them humanity, is the last result of our much praised civilization, the final achievement of all the efforts and struggles of hundreds of generations to improve their own situation and that of their posterity." Unquote. Scenes of discordant sexual life punctuate this portrait of the impact of industrial capital on the lives of the working poor. Men, women, and children sleep in revolting confusion. Disordered functions of the uterus are almost universal among girls, and working women manifest an actual dislike to family life. Sex is chaotic, pregnancies are illegitimate and early, and prostitution's rampant. Engels' anger flows from one breathless sentence to another. He pulls our attention up from the gutter every now and again to offer startling propositions. Quote, "We must either despair of mankind and its aims and efforts when we see all our labor and toil result in such a mockery, or we must admit that human society has hitherto sought salvation in a false direction. We must admit that so total a reversal of the position of the sexes can have come to pass only because the sexes have been placed in a false position from the beginning. If the reign of the wife over the husband, as inevitably brought about by the factory system, is inhuman, the pristine rule of the husband over the wife must have been inhuman too. If the wife can now base her supremacy upon the fact that she supplies the greater part, nay, the whole of the common possession, the necessary inference is that this community of possession is no true and rational one, since one member of the family boasts offensively of contributing the greater share. If the family of our present society is being thus dissolved, this dissolution merely shows that, at bottom, the binding tie of this family was not family affection, but private interest lurking under the cloak of a pretended community of possessions." Unquote. That word pretended denaturalizes the monogamous patriarchal family. The juxtaposition of community and possessions is meant to shock us out of our sentimental attachments to marriage and home. Marxist literature is haunted by the injuries that private property systems inflict on what is taken to be our most intimate forms of relation. It is also activated by a sense that things might be otherwise. The denaturalization of intimacy practices, for example marriage, and their attendant identity formations, wife, mother, and so on, are received by some people as an affront, a negation of a sense of natural order and being. It can take work to recognize and appreciate the fact that we experience the phenomena of being in a body through dynamic, contingent structures of thought and feeling, and that where nature ends and culture begins is never a given, if only because the very idea of nature is itself a social thing. Yes, the body is there. My point is not that the body is a mirage. It is more nearly that the body is a thing we live through. Furthermore, we live through our bodies together. Some know this all too well, as our experiences of the body, love and desire, are marked by one system or another as alien and unnatural. We feel the relationship between our lives and the state when the social worker knocks on the door to check unannounced on the quality of our homes, when we get on buses, trains, even planes to get the abortions we need but which our local governments deny us, when we are policed while using the women's bathroom, when our families cut us out of their lives, when whole governments mobilize to manage us out of existence. Some of us can feel in the thickening of the atmosphere of a room the degree to which we are conjured, desired, and feared. You may be picking up this volume because you feel these entanglements. If sexual life haunts the margins of Marx's and Engels' texts, it is in the origin of the family, private property, and the state that the ghost is confronted. The book's title is an argument. If there is an origin story for these three structures, there's also a time before, a world populated by other forms of kinship and relationships to people, resources, and to land. And indeed, much of the book is dedicated to representing the work of those who studied kinship practices across the globe and across time, and who attempted to map the relationship between kinship and socio-political dynamics. Eleanor Burke Leacock's introduction will orient you towards the book's strengths and its limits as a work of anthropology. She importantly reminds readers that Engels's work was, for a long time, relegated to the status of a woman's book, peripheral to the scholarly domain. It still sits there, sought out by scholars of feminist thought and those Marxists who commit themselves to understanding the relationship between sexual and economic life. The book's assertions, especially those concerning matrilineal kinship systems, were shocking not only for its first readers, but for the generations of 20th century scholars who worked to shore up the disciplinary architecture of white patriarchy. This book declares that one cannot theorize the operations of a private property system without understanding social systems of belonging and exclusion that manage the reproduction of life and labor. Even though intersectional modes of analysis do not inform the text, when Engels centers kinship and social reproduction in his analysis, he makes an important contribution to the development of intersectional practices in Marxist thought. A full reckoning with the relationship between division, alienation, and exploitation requires theoretical models like Gail Rubin's sex-gender system, quote, a systematic social apparatus which takes up females as raw materials and fashioned domesticated women as products, unquote, and Cedric Robinson's theorizations of racial capitalism and black radical contributions to anti-capitalist struggle, to name just two major figures who have taken on the kinds of questions that drive this work. I encourage people to read Engels' work in the intellectual and historical context of its composition, as well as the intersectional decolonial context through which we read it today. This book grew out of Marx's notes on Lewis H. Morgan's works, which include League of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, 1851, Systems of Consanguinity and Affinity of the Human Family, 1871, and Ancient Society, Researches in the Lines of Human Progress from Savagery through Barbarism to Civilization, 1877. Marx and Engels followed and debated ethnological work of that period. Both saw in the general intellectual project of the emerging discipline a potential ally for their own work exploring social transformation over time. After Marx's death in 1883, Engels took on the work of realizing his collaborators' unpublished projects. Lewis Morgan's work figured heavily in Marx's papers. Morgan presented forms of human society as emerging in dynamic tension with the natural environment. The family in his work is a mobile, historically contingent, and material structure. Importantly, for Marx and Engels, Morgan links the specific shape and character of kinship systems to the access and control of material resources. He offers a developmental model in which one kinship system evolves from and retains the traces of another. These stages in the evolution of kinship are also in Morgan's work associated with the emergence of a wider range of cultural developments. For example, the use of certain kinds of tools, the development of language, property relations, etc. Marx and Engels recognized elements of their own intellectual project in Morgan's emphasis on the relationship between material conditions, such as the availability of resources, population growth, and social systems. From the American's work, Engels that the forms that hold our family and belonging have a developmental origin in mother-centered societies characterized by group marriage, greater forms of sexual autonomy, for example, marriages that were more easily dissolved, and also by group parenting. In a direct challenge to the thinking of the day, he identifies the unraveling of these social forms not as a manifestation of men's inherent strength and natural inclination, but as an effect of the development of practices enabling a shift from labor oriented by immediate need to labor oriented towards producing goods that could be stored, exchanged, and transmitted from one generation to another. As these systems evolve, women, via their reproductive capacity, become a resource controlled by a patriarchal head of the household through whom the lines of inheritance are articulated. The spirit of Engels's linking of family structures with property systems and his developmental argument is lifted directly from Morgan's work. Origins closes with a long citation from Morgan's work pulled from the conclusion to ancient society. Since the advent of civilization, that passage opens, the outgrowth of property has been so immense, its forms so diversified, its uses so expanding, and its management so intelligent in the interest of its owners, that it has become on the part of the people an unmanageable power. The human mind stands bewildered in the presence of its own creation. Unquote. For Marx and Engels, work like Morgan's was important to the dismantling of exactly this bewilderment. Morgan's Ancient Society, in particular, showed that it was possible to historicize relationships between people and property. The project furthermore implicates intimacy and kinship in larger systems. The family is a fractal expression of the logic of the whole. In his notes on Morgan's text, Marx asserts that the modern family, quote, contains in miniature all the contradictions which later extend throughout society and its state. Unquote. Origins more than earns its place on the feminist bookshelf. As Imani Perry writes, we encounter, quote, modern patriarchy at the intersection of three legal formations: personhood, sovereignty, and property, unquote, an intersection from which it generates human shapes for each of these categories. We see roots for this feminist argument in Engels' text. It is punctuated by lacerating sentences that describe the patriarchal family as a sinister entanglement of marriage and ownership. For Engels, the, quote, world historical defeat of the female sex, unquote, was precipitated in part and most crucially by the accumulation of chattel, livestock, and slaves. The word family, he reminds us, has its roots in a Latin term, quote, invented by the Romans to denote a new social organism whose head ruled over wife and children and a number of slaves, and was invested under Roman paternal power with rights of life and death over them all. Unquote. This form of patriarchy, he declares, produces its own unholy trinity of subordinates: wife, prostitute, and slave. Engels writes, it is the existence of slavery side by side with monogamy, the presence of young beautiful slaves belonging unreservedly to the man, that stems monogamy from the very beginning with its specific character of monogamy for the woman only but not for the man, and that is the character it still has today. Unquote. Within this form of the family, which reproduces itself across time in the controlled transmission of property from one generation to the next through a paternal line, women become property's intimates. They are its managers, they are property themselves, and they are an amalgamation of both. This family system is deeply implicated in capitalist forms of exploitation and, Engels argues, must be dismantled. Quote, it will be plain that the first condition for the liberation of the wife is to bring the whole female sex back into public industry, and that this in turn demands the abolition of the monogamous family as the economic unit of society. Unquote. Marxist feminists have pushed these arguments much further. The problem for the Marxist feminist reader lies not in Engels' spirited critique of the patriarchal monogamous family unit, but in the sense of evolutionary progression that locates women in a kind of pre-colonial, pre-capitalist space, and which situates the path to liberty in women's entry into the proletariat. Marx notes on Morgan emphasized Morgan's take on the family as a kind of social fossil, holding people in archaic forms of relation. Quote, the modern family contains in germ not only slavery, servitus, but also serfdom. Unquote. Non-feminist Marxist work underestimates the importance of reproduction as quote-unquote underdeveloped, undervalued, underpaid, difficult to index, and so on, to capitalism's functioning. Had they taken as their paradigmatic labor form the combinations of enslaved, free and waged labor staged on and around the plantation, extending their view from the textile mills to slave markets and the cotton fields, Marx and Engels might have written differently about the family and tied the narrative offered in Origins more closely to the processes they elsewhere theorize as primitive accumulation. Marx defines primitive accumulation as, quote, nothing else than the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. It appears as primitive because it forms the prehistoric stage of capital and of the mode of production corresponding with it. Unquote. The figuration of primitive accumulation as a prehistorical stage of capital is hard to sustain, however, when one considers, for example, the suite of not so ancient practices that, as Hortense Spillers writes, quote, demarcate a total objectification as an entire captive community becomes a living laboratory. Unquote. This zone is important to Cedric Robinson's interventions. He writes, quote, certainly slave labor was one of the bases for what Marx termed primitive accumulation, but it would be an error to arrest the relationship there, assigning slave labor to some pre-capitalist stage of history. Unquote. The failure to take up these large questions, that is, the operations of racialism in the kinship system described by Engels here, the role racism plays in wealth accumulation described in Capital, meant, quote, that the interpretation of history in terms of the dialectic of capitalist class struggles would prove inadequate. Unquote. Introductions to this text usually include warnings. White supremacist, eugenicist language is threaded throughout Morgan's text, upon which Engels is heavily reliant. This is most obvious in the language used to characterize phases in the development of human society: savagery, barbarism, and civilization. Morgan linked the technological capacities of social groups to physiological differences. Indigenous communities are described by Morgan as physical equivalents of early man. Engels mirrors these elements of Morgan's work in especially his paraphrasing of the ethnologist's writing in the opening section of this text, Stages of Prehistoric Culture, in which Engels assumes, for example, alignments between social development and brain size. Rather than gloss this over, I want to pause to reflect on the colonial scene of the work that so inspired Marx and Engels. The sense of living in an inevitably ruined world haunts this body of literature. It is one of the most seductive of Marxist moods, and it is a key feature of settler colonial thinking and feeling as it congeals into what Renato Rosaldo theorized as imperialist nostalgia, mourning for what one has destroyed. Behind this text is the story of an asymmetrical friendship between men. Section 2, The Family, opens with a description of Morgan as having spent, quote, a great part of his life among the Iroquois Indians, settled to this day in New York State. Unquote. Morgan's credentials as an authority on Iroquois life are sealed by the fact that he was adopted into one of their tribes, the Senecas. Morgan lived in Rochester, New York, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Onondaga, or Senecas of the League of Iroquois people. He founded a fraternal organization whose structure was modeled after the Iroquois Confederacy and whose initiation ceremonies, Scott Michelson explains, quote, involve turning Anglo men into modern-day representatives of the dead Cayuga Indian warriors, unquote. Community theaters of cultural appropriation, societies like this abounded during the period and generated a sense of deep time for white men longing for their own sense of the ancient, for what they saw as a purer, more authentic mode of living. From these rituals and their attendant narratives, they salvaged a sense of national identity from what they saw as an inevitably disappearing native world. Morgan's scholarship on Iroquois society evolved directly from his life within this fraternal order. It was important to him that the language and rituals used in his society be accurate, and so he incorporated the study of Iroquois tradition and ritual into the group's mandate. As Philip Deloria writes, this attempt to shore up the integrity of the club's citations of Iroquois practices instituted a major shift as members, quote, found themselves dealing not simply with their own cultural imagination, but with actual Indian people, unquote. It was at this moment that Morgan struck up a friendship with the teenage Eli S. Parker, a member of a respected Tonawanda Seneca family. Morgan's work was dependent on Parker and his family as they generously shared information and facilitated his invitations to spend time on the reserve. Long sections of his League of the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, reproduce Parker's writings. That book is dedicated to him. Today, Parker is sometimes acknowledged as the book's co-author. Eli Parker's biography is remarkable. He was the Tonawanda Seneca Sachem leader and worked as military secretary to Ulysses S. Grant during the U.S. Civil War. Parker drafted the terms of Robert E. Lee's surrender. In 1871, Grant appointed him Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Michel Rahia observes, Parker held positions of power in the U.S. government unmatched by Indians even by 21st century standards, unquote. He left behind a rich, complex archive of largely unpublished material that Rahea and other scholars describe as offering important counter-narratives to Morgan's writings, as well as strategic forms of silence and biting satire with regard to Morgan's attempt to not just appreciate and understand Iroquois society, but to actually become Indian. As Morgan's text went on to become a key and controversial work of anthropology, inspiring Marx and Engels, Parker disappears from Marxism, dissolving into so much raw data. Parker's archive has surfaced in a different interdisciplinary space, in indigenous and ethnic studies. His writing and his negotiation of his relationship to Morgan is an important site of reflection regarding settler-indigenous relationships, race and identity, subaltern histories, and the formation of the disciplines of ethnology and anthropology. When reading The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, it is worth keeping in mind the worlds from which its information is drawn, actually existing members of the Seneca Nation, navigating settler networks of power in a context in which people were enduring waves of dispossession. The interdisciplinary field of indigenous studies offers readers of this text urgent and necessary forms of intervention, especially where activists and scholars work from the dialectical models that Morgan and Engels sensed but he didn't quite get. Although Engels asserts a dynamic relationship between kinship, socio-political structures, and access to natural resources, that long dialectical process is, in origins, a historical function rather than an intentional ongoing social practice. Echoing the work of numbers of decolonial activists and scholars, Audra Simpson writes that radical indigenous commitments to place and water-centered lives persist, not as stasis, but in a dialectical tension between these core commitments to life, land, and water, unquote. Yellowknife's Dean scholar Glenn Coulthard, in his rethinking of Marxist theorizations of primitive accumulation, identifies indigenous mobilizations in the struggle over life, land, and water as interventions against the processes of dispossession that Marx in Capital and Engels in this text situate in a colonial past. Coulthard asks us to, quote, elevate dispossession not as some backdrop or some historical starting point, but as an ongoing feature of the reproduction of colonial and capitalist social relations in our present, unquote. The movement to address the crisis of missing and murdered indigenous women, the Standing Rock Sioux tribes' fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline, native Hawaiian efforts to protect the sacred site of Mauna Kea. These are the struggles of the here and now. I return here to Mary Burns and to the sad fact that we know so little about her. There's no treasure trove of unpublished writing to mine for insights into her contributions to Engels's publications about the family. Even secondary information about her is faint, a reflection of the fact Engels kept his life with the Burns women at a slight remove from his public life. Even the claim that she played an important role in the development of the condition of the working class in England is a deduction. In literature, in the exploration of Engels's life and work, her story is one of speculation. And speculate we do. Take, for example, Engels' own imaginative ideas about class and sexual freedom. He argues that among the bourgeoisie, marriage is primarily a means of asset management and is, at its root, a form of prostitution for both husband and wife. The wife here, quotes, only differs from the courtesan in that she does not let out her body on piecework as a wage worker, but sells it once and for all into slavery, unquote. And from there he projects a desire for sexual freedom downward. Quote, sex love with a woman becomes, and only becomes, the real rule among the oppressed classes, which means today among the proletariat, whether this relation is sanctioned or not, unquote. How is that not a statement about the direction of his own desires? There are very few traces in his work of an intellectual engagement with the sexual radicalism that grew around Marx and Engels in the last decades of their lives. This book was written at a moment when writers, scholars, artists, and activists were openly renegotiating the terms of the family, love, and intimacy. To give you a sense of just how close that spirit was to Engels' circles, let me just describe one area in which one might reasonably expect awareness. Generations of 19th century readers picked up Leaves of Grass, first published in 1855, and turned to each other to ask, do you see what I see? Many of those readers were socialists, gay, and found in Whitman's writing a space in which these aspects of their being could be imagined in an organic harmony. Those readers included Edward Carpenter, one of the first to issue public calls for change in laws criminalizing homosexuality, and an important figure in the history of the socialist movement in England. His book-length poem Towards Democracy was modeled on Leaves of Grass, and is even more explicit in its vision for a utopian alignment of sexual freedom with the elimination of exploitation and wealth accumulation. Carpenter, whose home functioned as an experimental utopian community and whose partner, George Merrill, was, like Mary Burns, working class, was not even a degree removed from Engels. Carpenter read Engels and Lewis Morgan's work, and was a member of the Socialist League, whose members included Eleanor Marx and, for a time, Engels. Carpenter and his circle questioned absolutely everything, including and especially the relationship between sex, love, family, property, and the state. One might locate Engels on the edges of other provocative networks, centered on figures like Oscar Wilde, Victoria Woodhull, and John Addington Symonds. The more one knows about the vibrant sexual politics of this period, the more surprising it is to find that heterosexuality is not up for analysis, especially in this text. When queer figures appear in the Marxist canon, sadly it's usually in the most passing commentary, where they appear as diseased figures of enabling complicity, keeping symbolic company with figures of prostitution. We see one example in a passage on the monogamous family. Quote, this Athenian family became in time the accepted model for domestic relations, not only among the Ionians but to an increasing extent among all the Greeks of the mainland and colonies also. But in spite of locks and guards, Greek women found plenty of opportunity for deceiving their husbands. The men, who would have been ashamed to show any love for their wives, amused themselves by all sorts of love affairs with heterae, but this degradation of the women was avenged on the men and degraded them also, till they fell into the abominable practice of sodomy, Knabenliebe, and degraded alike their gods and themselves with the myth of Ganymede. Unquote. The text that I've emphasized above has been the subject of some debate in socialist circles, as people have tried to sort out the question of Engels's views on homosexuality and debated this translation. Was he, for example, condemning homosexuality or pederasty, which is a more faithful translation of the word Knabenliebe? And in that condemnation, was he referring to same-sex intergenerational relationships or to child abuse? As much as one might wish otherwise, Engels's discourse lines up with the homophobic use of the term sodomy in this translation. Homophobic rhetoric thrives on the collapsing of homosexuality and pedophilia, casting same-sex intergenerational relationships as atavistic, crisis-ridden throwbacks. In my view, no translation of this passage will dig itself out from under the poverty of Marx's and Engels' thinking about sexuality. One finds Engels so close and yet so far from realizing the full potential of the important work of denaturalizing and demystifying the term family. Sex in this book is at once the site of mystification and material extraction. It is the scene of crime, the nature of which is rendered into a timeless mystery in order that this crime might live on as its own machine of perpetual motion. Origins attempts to understand the material conditions that shape our lives, our thoughts, our feelings, and our capacity to imagine things otherwise. In the narratives in which communism is positioned as the realization of technological developments that are the organic expression of capitalism's drive to produce surplus wealth, in narratives which insist that the path to this particular form of social collaboration must be routed through industrialization and colonization, as was the argument of Marx and Engels' earlier writings, a position they walked back over time, there is no accounting for the power of racial discourses and the ongoingness of white supremacy. The rethinking of historical narratives is a key feature of decolonial, anti-racist, and feminist engagements with Marxism. Realizing the analysis of the relationship between private property, the family, and the state requires that we confront the place of the before and the not yet, and embrace the space of the otherwise. European Marxists, Cedric Robinson writes, have presumed more frequently than not that their project is identical with world historical development. Unquote. Marxists writing from other positions and engaging that tradition are tasked with unraveling its givens. That is the project towards which I am gesturing here. That is the project towards which I am gesturing here. Introduction, Engels and the History of Women's Oppression by Eleanor Burke Leacock from 1979. In this paper, I put forth the proposition that the continued separation of woman's position from the central core of social analysis, as an and, but, or however, cannot but lead to continued distortions. This might be so because of the simple fact that women constitute half of humanity. The point I suggest instead is that the notion of a somehow separate woman's role hides the reality of the family as an economic unit, an institution as crucial for the continued exploitation of working men as it is for the oppression of women. To understand this family form and its origins is fundamental to the interpretation of social structure, past and present, and to the understanding of how to fight for and win the right of the world's people to make decisions about their future. Relegation of family forms to secondary questions about woman's role has hindered us in our effort to comprehend the origins of class society, the dynamics of its perpetuation, and the shape of its full negation. The same has been true of racial and national oppression, for they have also been relegated to the status of secondary issues in contemporary Marxist analysis, with serious consequences, both theoretical and political. Before developing my central point concerning family forms and their relevance to the interpretation of history, I shall review this parallel problem briefly. As Marx pointed out, it was the expansion of the European market into the world market that transformed mercantile Europe into capitalist Europe. Historically, then, capitalism has been inseparable from racist brutality and national oppression throughout its history. Yet, few Western scholars have chosen to explore all the ramification of this connection. Marx unveiled the mystery of the commodity production and the fetishism of money. He revealed the process whereby direct relations among people, as they labored to produce and to exchange the goods they then consumed, were transformed by the emergence of commodity production for profit, so that people's very labor became an alien force against them. In other words, Marx analyzed the nature of exploitation itself as a principle, and as a principle it was and is colorless, raceless, and sexless. However, in the course of organizational failures and confusions in advanced capitalist countries, exploitation somehow became defined as centrally of whites and of men. Seduced by the divide and rule ploys that are constantly generated from the competitiveness inherent in capitalist structure and that are consciously reinforced by the servants of the powerful as well, Scholars and self-styled revolutionaries, white and male, accepted the bribe of pitiful involvement in personal and petty oppression, and bemused analyzed society in their image, including in the very nature of exploitation itself. The unifying power of the concept was destroyed by the hardening into dogma of a pernicious dichotomization whereby the exploitation of the industrial worker, white and male, was pitted against the compounded exploitation and cruel oppression of the non-white as well as the non-male. The theoretical separation of class exploitation from other forms of oppression contributed to the tragic undermining of a revolutionary socialist movement in the United States following World War II. Black revolutionaries were forced to divide themselves in two to dichotomize the oppression of their people through ritual statements that their exploitation as workers was more fundamental than their oppression as blacks. Thereby, the special and powerful anger of black people was defined as inherently counter revolutionary. I remember a black woman comrade, years ago now, saying, I don't care what they say. First, I am a N word, the term black being then still a term of abuse. Then I am a worker. Unquote. Her third identity, powerfully adding to the totality of her oppression, hence her potential as a revolutionary, that of a woman she did not even express, so submerged then was such identification in the idiocies of a theoretically sterile organizational politicking. To pit national or racial oppression against class exploitation is a sophomoric sociological enterprise. It is not Marxist analysis. That people of color can fall across class lines, a few of them, has befuddled our thinking insofar as we are metaphysical and not dialectical. Class exploitation and racial and national oppression are all of a piece, for in their joining lay the victory of capitalist relations. To pursue this line of criticism in a more academic context, consider the extent to which United States history has been written as the history of white men. The contribution from the left has mainly been to stress that the black experience must be added. Recently, some American Indians and now women are being tacked on as well, as if it were a matter of merely adding these extras to make the whole rather than a matter of fundamental rethinking. Consider also how the history of capitalist development has been written as if wholly white, deriving almost totally from internal European processes. Relations with Africa, Asia, and the New World are seen as extras, as gravy, unimportant until quite late when they set off Europe's final imperialist explosion. It is agreed that the English capital, which made industrialization possible, was derived in major part from the triangular trade in slaves, rum, and sugar, produced in what were models for European factories, the sugar mills of the Caribbean plantations, and then the significance of the fact is forgotten. W. E. B. Du Bois and Eric Williams are respectfully saluted, and their work is ignored or said to be overstated. It is as if the victory of bourgeois market relations over feudalism and the freeing of workers to sell their labor were largely internal European developments that involved only white men. In fact, it was the uniting of class, race, and national exploitation and oppression on a world scale that made the triumph of the European bourgeoisie possible. The reality was all too painfully evident to Toussaint Louverture when he unsuccessfully tried to win support for a free Haiti from the revolutionary French bourgeoisie, as C. L. R. James so masterfully relates. Sometimes it is argued that racial and national oppressions were in theory not essential to a victory of capitalist relations. The argument is fruitless, for historically they were joint. True, it was an accident of human physical differentiation that peninsular Europe was inhabited by a people who had lost much of the melanin in their skin, as it was an accident of geography that it was an area with many harbors and waterways, and relatively available coal and iron that made possible primary industrialization once the area had caught up with the ancient urban world. On another planet, it might have been different. On ours, however, when it behooved energetic merchants to wring great profits from workers other than those in their own nations, color offered a convenient excuse. The first rationale for slavery was religious, since economic conflicts in Europe had been fought for so long in religious terms. Heathens were natural slaves. The rationale did not last long, since heathens could easily convert, at least nominally, when it was in their interest to do so. Color, an elaboration of the white man's burden, then became the excuse for conquest, plunder, and enslavement of non Europeans. Racism did, and still does, serve powerfully to divide the world's workers. It befuddles the scholar as well. Were humanity either wholly white or wholly black, would the early history of exploitation and oppression in the Third World be considered as somehow apart from, or as merely supplementary to, exploitation of Western workers? I trust I have labored my points sufficiently. At present, Marxist social scientists and revolutionaries in Latin America and Africa are beginning to clarify these issues. Today, there are many who recognize that it is critical to sort out true and false oppositions in joining the struggle of the world's people to bury class society before it buries us all. The point I want to make here is that the same is true when it comes to the oppression of women. And sex oppression goes further back, not just to the rise of capitalist class relations, but to the origins of class itself. According to the happenstances of disciplinary boundaries as they became defined in the 19th century, the task of analyzing the nature and origin of women's oppression has fallen to us as anthropologists. I cannot say that we have risen to the task. The dominant view today is that women have always been some degree oppressed. The usual term is dominated by men. Because men are stronger, they are responsible for fighting, and it is in their nature to be more aggressive. In the United States, the position has been stated most fully by Tiger and Fox. Fox, in fact, uses the term man literally to mean male rather than generically human. As man evolved, he evolved exogamously, writes Fox. At some point in the evolution of his behavior, he began to define social units and to apply rules about the recruitment of people to these units and the allocation of women amongst them. Unquote. Referring to Levi Strauss, he elaborates his theory of human evolution with we as male and women as passive objects of exchange. Quote, for in behavior as in anatomy, the strength of our lineage lay in a relatively generalized structure. It was precisely because we did not specialize like our baboon cousins that we had to contrive solutions involving the control and exchange of females. Unquote. Fox's basically biological view is gaining in popularity, containing, as it does, fashionable allusions to Levi Strauss. However, more common among those who discuss sex roles are blunt judgments, empirically phrased, that casually relegate to the wastebasket of history the profound questions about women's status that were raised by 19th century writers. Quote, it is common sociological truth that in all societies authority is held by men, not women, writes Beidelman. At both primitive and advanced levels, men tend regularly to dominate women, states Goldschmidt. Men have always been politically and economically dominant over women, reports Harris. Some women join in. Women's work is always private, while, quote, roles within the public sphere are the province of men, write Hammond and Jablow. Therefore, quote, women can exert influence outside the family only indirectly through their influence on their kinsmen, unquote. The first problem with such statements is their lack of historical perspective. To generalize from cross-cultural data gathered almost wholly in the 20th century is to ignore changes that have been taking place for anywhere up to 500 years as a result of involvement first with European mercantilism, then with a full-scale colonialism and imperialism. Indeed, there is almost a kind of racism involved, an assumption that the cultures of third world peoples have virtually stood still until destroyed by the recent mushrooming of urban industrialism. Certainly, one of the most consistent and widely documented changes brought about during the colonial period was a decline in the status of women relative to men. The causes were partly indirect, as the introduction of wage labor for men and the trade of basic commodities speeded up processes whereby tribal collectives were breaking up into individual family units in which women and children were becoming economically dependent on single men. The process was aided by the formal allocation to men of whatever public authority and legal right of ownership was allowed in colonial situations by missionary teachings and by the persistence of Europeans in dealing with men as the holders of all formal authority. The second problem with statements like the above is largely a theoretical one, the common use of some polar dimension to assess woman's position and to find that everywhere men are dominant and hold authority over women not only ignores the world's history, but transmutes the totality of tribal decision-making structures, as we try to reconstruct them, into the power terms of our own society. Lewis Henry Morgan had a marvelous phrase for such practice. He used it when talking of the term instinct, but it is generally apt. Such a term, he wrote, is quote, a system of philosophy in a definition and installation of the supernatural which silences at once all inquiry into the facts. Unquote. In this instance, women are conveniently allocated to their place, and the whole inquiry into the structure of the primitive collective is stunted. The primitive collective emerges with no structure, no contradictions of its own. It is merely our society minus, so to speak. Two example Two examples help clarify these points. On history, take the Balunda, one of the Lunda Bantu peoples of the Congo. In his Handbook of African Peoples, Murdoch writes of political authority among them as, quote, vested in a headman and council of lineage or family heads within the local community, and over these district or sub-tribal chiefs with important ritual functions, unquote. All are taken for granted as men. Murdoch goes on to say that although the Balonda are patrilineal and patrilocal, their Crow kinship terminology, plus a number of related practices, suggests that they were originally matrilineal and avunculocal like neighboring Bantu peoples. Murdoch is a careful and conscientious scholar, and he or his assistants did, I am sure, scan the some dozen references English and French, that he lists. Nonetheless, there is no mention of David Livingstone's encounter with the Balunda when he was traveling through the area in 1857. At that time, women, as well as men, were chiefs. Livingstone's account of a young woman chief in her 20s and her self-assurance, both in relation to him and to the district chief, her maternal uncle, is so revealing that I am going to give it at some length. Livingstone entered a Balonda village on the 6th of January and was brought before the chief. He wrote that a man and a woman were sitting on skins placed in the middle of a circle, 30 paces in diameter, a little raised above the ordinary level of the ground. His men put their arms down. Livingstone continued, and I walked up to the center of the circular bench and saluted him in the usual way by clapping the hands together in their fashion. He pointed to his wife, as much to say, the honor belongs to her. I saluted her in the same way, and, a mat having been brought, I squatted down in front of them. The talker was then called, and I was asked who was my spokesman. Unquote. This was Nyamoana, sister of Shinti, and mother of Manenko, a young woman chief. The discussion proceeded, Livingstone to his interpreter, the interpreter to Nyamoana's talker, the talker to her husband to her, the response moving back through the same chain. Livingstone wanted to travel on alone to Nyamoana's brother, Shinti, while Nyamoana wanted her people to accompany the missionary. The arrival of Manenko, the young chief, and her husband ended the argument, and much to Livingstone's annoyance, Manenko was to take him to Shinti. Quote, as neither my men nor myself had much inclination to encounter a scolding, we made ready the packages, he wrote. However, there was some delay on Manenko's part, so Livingstone seized the opportunity to leave. She intervened. Quote, she seized the luggage and seized the luggage and declared that she would carry it in spite of me. My men succumbed sooner to this petticoat government than I felt inclined to do, and left me no power. And being unwilling to encounter her tongue, I was moving off to the canoes, when she gave me a kind explanation, and, with her hand on my shoulder, put on a motherly look, saying, now, my little man, just do as the rest have done. My feelings of annoyance, of course, vanished, and I went out to try and get some meat. Unquote. They walked too fast for the comfort of Livingstone's men, Manenko without any protection from the cold rain. Livingstone was told that chiefs must always wear the appearance of robust youth and bear vicissitudes without wincing. When they arrived at the district chief's, Livingstone gave him an ox, whereupon Manenko angrily asserted it to be hers. Livingstone was, quote, her white man, she declared, and she had her men slaughter the ox and give her uncle one leg. Livingstone noted, Shinty did not seem at all annoyed at the occurrence, thereby corroborating the correctness of Manenko's position. Everywhere in Africa that one scrapes the surface, one finds ethno-historical data on the authority once shared by women but later lost. However, to leave the matter at this and argue a position of matriarchy as a stage of social evolution is but the other phase of the male dominance argument. Pleasant for a change, to be sure, but not the true story. For what such data reveal is the dispersed nature of decision making in pre class societies, the key to understanding how such societies functioned as collectives. The second example from the Montagnais Naskapi of eastern Canada makes this point clear. Here we have more than just hints of early Naskapi scattered through various documents. Instead, we have rich ethno-historical data in the Jesuit relations, particularly in the letters of Father Paul Lejeune wrote back to his superiors in France in the 1630s. Elsewhere, I have written of the Naskapi at length, of the fur trade and its impact on the band collective, of the emergence of the individual trap line, improperly called the privately owned hunting territory, and of the changing position of women. The early accounts indicate a matrilocal emphasis in Naskapi society and refer to the considerable power held by women. The 20th century ethnographies, on the other hand, indicate a loose structure with an emphasis on patrilocality and infer male authority. Both early and late, however, considerable flexibility is reported with no hardened formal structure. Therefore, social practices shifted without the same kind of overt recognition and resistance as, say, that among the Pueblo Indians of the Southwest who have long struggled to maintain their mores. To the ethnographers of the early 20th century, the Indians, camping temporarily here and there in the woods in the winter, speaking their own language almost exclusively, wearing moccasins of traditional style, sharing game animals within the group, and still remembering much of their pre-metal tool technology, appeared little changed from the pre-Columbian times. In fact, however, the economic basis for the multi-family groups that lived collectively as winter units and that had links with parallel groups which could be activated in times of need had been fundamentally undercut by the fur trade. The beaver and other fur bearers had been transformed from animals that were immediately consumed, the meat eaten and the fur used, to commodities, goods to be kept, individually owned until exchanged for goods upon which the Indians had come increasingly to depend. The process whereby goods were transformed into commodities, although completed early in the old centers of trade, was still incomplete in outlying areas well into the 20th century, so that the outlines of the change could be reconstructed from my fieldwork, with the 17th century Jesuit records serving as the baseline. In the 1630s, individuals within Naskapi society were autonomous. People made decisions about activities for which they were responsible. Group decisions were arrived at through feeling for consensus. The essential and direct interdependence of the group as a whole both necessitated this autonomy and made it possible as a viable system. Total interdependence was inseparable from real autonomy. The relations document the the relations document the ethic of group solidarity as bound up with individual autonomy that together characterized the Naskapi. The emphasis was on generosity, on cooperation, on patience and good humor, but also on never forcing one's will on others. This ethic was enforced through ridicule and teasing, often bawdy, behind which lay the thread of great anger at injustice and a deep fear of starvation that might ultimately force individual hunters to abandon the group in order that someone might survive. The psychological expression of this fear was a cannibal monster, the Witigo, and a cannibalistic psychosis. The Sagamores or headmen were spokesmen or intermediaries for the group. They held no formal power. Quote, They have reproached me 100 times because we fear our captains, while they laugh at and make sport of theirs, bemoaned Lejeune. They, cannot endure in the least those who seem desirous of assuming superiority over others. They place all virtue in a certain gentleness or apathy. Unquote. Shamans were often people of considerable personal influence. Women as well as men became shamans at that time. This has ceased to be the case. In one incident recounted in the Relations, a woman shaman took over from a man who had not succeeded in reaching the gods. She began to shake the houses and, to sing and cry so loudly that she caused the devil to come, whereupon she called upon the people to rally in war against the Iroquois. When a Jesuit father took her to task, she drew a knife and threatened to kill him. Personally, I've been tempted to think of women as natural peacemakers. It is a role they play in many societies. Among the Naskapi, however, women joined in the protracted torture of Iroquois prisoners with even more fury than the men, in bitter anger at the loss of kinsmen dear to them. As for the notion of women obeying their husbands, the Relations are full of arguments over this issue, with women running away from zealous male converts who were threatening to punish them for disobedience. Reconstructed bits and pieces from the last 500 years of North American Indian history suggest that parallel development took place quite widely among previously egalitarian peoples. As trade and in some cases wage labor undercut the collective economy, chiefs and other men of influence began to play roles beyond that of spokesmen, often as entrepreneurial go-betweens in commercial matters, or as leaders of resistance, and the masculine authority of ethnographic accounts took shape, although doubtless often exaggerated as they depended largely on male informants. Under colonial conditions, the public and the private sphere became divided, as had not been the case when the household was the community, and the public sphere became invested with a semblance of the male power it represents in state organized society. However, to consider latter day chiefs as having held ultimate authority in earlier tribal terms is to distort the structure of societies in which relations with outside groups were not yet combined with an internal economic basis for the exercise of individual power. At first blush, the fact that in some instances chiefly authority was undercut by the colonial usurpation of power would seem to contradict the above. However, while the great reaches of the north and northeast, down into the western plains and plateaus, constituted a huge area in which collective life was as yet unchallenged. In the southern and coastal areas of what became the United States and Canada, Native American societies were developing internal cleavages prior to Columbus. I have been using the term tribal in an inappropriately undifferentiated manner in order to make my general point. In fact, however, the lumping of non-Western and non-Oriental peoples into a single category of primitive, pre-literate, tribal, etc., that is then contrasted with civilization, has been a source of confusions which are not yet entirely cleared up. Classes, with their contradictory properties of freeing human ability and creativity through specialization of labor, while at the same time alienating the producers from control over the products of their labor, were of course developed or developing in many parts of the so-called primitive world prior to European colonialism. What is of moment in the present argument, however, is that in both egalitarian societies, where chiefly authority was a matter of purely personal influence, and in stratified societies where it was based on some form of economic control over a significant part of the society's production, or whatever variation on the two principles or the combination of them in fact existed in the historic moment of any given society at the time of Columbus, at the heart of subsequent changes in group structure was the delineation or strengthening of the family as an economic unit and its separation from essential dependence on band or kin ties. The authority structure of egalitarian societies, where all individuals were equally dependent on a collective larger than the nuclear family, was one of wide dispersal or decision making among mature and elder women and men who essentially made decisions, either singly in small groups or collectively, about those activities which it was their socially defined responsibility to carry out. Taken together, these constituted the public life of the group. These were the decisions about the production and distribution of goods, about the maintenance, building, and moving of the camp or village, about learning and practicing various specialties and crafts, and becoming curers, artists, priests, dancers, storytellers, etc., about the settlement of internal disputes and enforcement of group norms, about feasts connected with birth, adolescence, death, and other rites of passage, about marriage, about ceremonial life, and the extra-legal or antisocial manipulation of supernatural power, about the declaration of war and the making of peace. Even a casual consideration of any non-stratified society one knows reveals that in the pre-colonial context, insofar as the culture can be reconstructed, to speak simply of men as dominant over women distorts the varied processes by which decisions in the above areas were made. In order to grasp the nature of the social collective from which class divisions arose, it is essential to grasp the implications of decision-making as widely dispersed with no one holding power over another by social fiat, only by personal influence. All of this is nothing new, of course, since Engels outlined the entire proposition in The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. It is the more surprising, therefore, that so little additional study has been made of the processes whereby the emergence of commodity production and a merchant class were interrelated with the breakdown of the tribal collective into individual units that were economically responsible privately for rearing a new generation. The male bias to which I have already alluded is part of the reason why Origin has not been taken more seriously. However, a good part also lies in the brevity and design of the book itself. Although one must check for distortions in the ethnography of a group, for example, take men exchanging women in Australia, older men may spend a great deal of time talking about such exchange, as to heart and filling, but older women are also involved. Sons are married off by elders as well, and the young people do have ways of refusing if they are dead set against the marriage. Furthermore, marriage is not that big a deal anyway, since divorce is easy, and sexual exclusiveness a foreign concept. The talk of power by men over women in such instances, as if it were the power of a Victorian father to consign his daughter for a life of personal servitude to a man she dislikes, is ethnocentric distortion. The male bias to which I have already alluded is part of the reason why Origin has not been taken more seriously. However, a good part also lies in the brevity and design of the book itself. Origin sets up a paradigm, a model of tribal society as contrasted with class society. Virtually all of the non-European and non-Oriental world are placed in the first category, and Greece, Rome, and early Germany are used as examples of the transition from collective kin-based to class-organized society. Therefore, the book leaves in a very unsatisfactory state the colonial peoples who were in various stages of transition to class and state organization when their autonomous development was interrupted. Morgan's overcorrection of the Aztecs, so to speak, in his concerns to clarify distinctions between Aztec rule and more entrenched state organization, was accepted by Engels, so Origin had little applicability directly to New World urban societies. And the fact that Morgan, Marx, and Engels all shared an ethnocentric ignorance of Africa has limited the applicability of Origin to the analysis of African kingdoms. Furthermore, Engels's lack of any reference to the Oriental society that so interested Marx and that subsumed in a general way the patriarchal societies of the East and of the classical Mediterranean that existed for thousands of years is a further shortcoming. Finally, perhaps, Engels's work has suffered precisely because it has been so accepted, for despite its shortcomings, it is still a masterful and profound theoretical synthesis. At a time when Marx is being taken off his pedestal as a god who ordained the future and is being seen increasingly as a man of great brilliance who armed people's hope for a better life with theoretical tools for organizing their fight for such a life, the fact that Engels's work has to such an extent been reduced to dogma has probably worked to its disadvantage, and again, first and last, it has been relegated to the status of a woman's book, peripheral to the scholarly domain. I cannot help but digress with an anecdote. Having sent a copy of the new edition of Origin with my introduction to a colleague whom I knew was interested in many of the questions I discussed, I asked for his reaction. He thanked me for sending the book and assured me that he had given it to his wife, who was very much engrossed in it. At present, then, we have something of a paradox. We are becoming acquainted with some of Marx's thinking about early social forms that he did not bring to publication in Capital or elsewhere, parts of the Grundrisse that predated it, and now the beautifully edited ethnological notebooks that followed it. Yet these are being considered strangely apart from Origin, as if they somehow superseded it, as if Origin did not represent in the main the product of both Marx's and Engels' thinking. After all, the questions the notebooks raise, the full significance of commodity production and its early development in relation to money, and then coinage, the relation between slave and free labor, between internal and external markets, between town and countryside in ancient society, were all discussed in Origin, along with their relation to the family as the fundamental economic unit in class society. A recent exception is Maria Rosa della Costa's Women and the Subversion of the Community, which elaborates on the economic significance of women's labor within the private confines of the family for the production of a new generation of workers. Dalla Costa also discusses distinctions between the patriarchal family and the capitalist family, as the center of production shifted from the patriarchal home to the factory. Again, however, in the contemporary academic setting in which Marxist anthropologists largely function, this is considered a women's article. In closing, I want to suggest the kinds of research questions that would begin to redress the imbalance I have been discussing. 1. Is the strongly institutionalized sex antagonism that is found among Melanesian and Latin American tropical forest horticulturists tied in with an early phase in the development of specialization and trade and the breaking up of the primitive collective? What are common features in both geographical areas? Are there parallels elsewhere, somewhat obscured by the happenstances of who writes about what and where? Is the formalized hostility related to incipient competitiveness over a surplus of food, at times allowed to rot in keeping with egalitarian pressures, yet beginning to operate as an independent force through trade? Is there a concomitant shift from matrilineal to patrilineal kinship? How widely was social structure affected by slaving? In Latin America, the Yanomama apparently came out on top of neighboring peoples in this respect, or by recruitment of plantation labor, so common in Melanesia. 2. What about the comparative study of cloth as a major form of goods that could be easily transformed into a commodity? In fact, cloth suggests itself as a perfect commodity, not only in Europe, and not only because of the first 100 pages of Capital, but because it is useful everywhere, and in many places essential for everyone, while at the same time it is capable of generating a widespread demand as a luxury item that must constantly be replaced. It is readily storable and not overly heavy for transportation, and it is very time-consuming to produce by hand. Cloth is indicated as important in the emergence of commodity production and in delineating of the extended family household as an economic unit. Note such items as Marx's references to wives and daughters producing cloth in the patriarchal Oriental household, references to traded cloth like those of the Lacerda, the 18th century Portuguese emissary to Angola and Zambia, the fact that England destroyed the Indian cloth industry when it took over that country, the discussion by John Mora on the role of cloth in strengthening the economic base of the Inca state, the probable importance of cloth manufacture in the development of classes in Mesopotamia. Informally, Robert Adams indicated to me that material on women as weaver workers and on their declining status are available for attempting to reconstruct the early relations of class and family in this area. The importance of cloth as a trade item among the Maya, June Nash informed me that the more independent women in late Maya society were those who were weavers as well as other specialists, potters, healers, midwives, and tradeswomen. 3. What about commodity production seen from a different vantage point, the market? The study of internal markets and external trade, as they related to the emergence of classes and the state, has clearly suffered from the failure to tie in the emergence of the family as an economic unit. In West Africa, for example, data on women as internal marketers and men as external traders have too often been the focus for argument over women's status relative to men, rather than the focus for reconstruction of class and state formation. A wealth of questions awaits research in this region, where for more than 500 years taxes from trade laid the basis for royal centers that maintained themselves along with standing armies and elaborate entourages. The historical rise and fall of these centers, the extent of urban development involved, and the nature of economic ties between these and surrounding agricultural village areas are questions clearly related to the delineation of at least upper class families as entrepreneurial economic units, and in many parts of West Africa, kin groups ceased functioning as collectives long before colonial times. West Africa offers data on the further topic, the resistance of women to the process of their exclusion from newly developing forms of public authority. 4. A problem of increasing interest today is the structure of those pre-capitalist class societies that have been loosely dubbed Oriental. In the congeries of questions to do with relations between city and countryside, nature of classes and extent of trade, the patriarchal extended family cannot be ignored as a central institution with its upper class and lower class variations. 5. I could continue indefinitely, but let me end with ideology. The series of fascinating questions about concepts of omniscience and omnipotence and absolute good and evil that accompany the rise of classical theocracies cannot ignore that what became a primary evil, sex, is represented by female temptation, not male. Are we going to leave this where Freud left it? When does the shift take place from female as symbolic of positive fertility to female as temptation to evil? Aztec theology was moving toward absolutes. Are there hints of the latter aspect? When does it appear in Mesopotamia? It was very early that the law codified that women could no longer take two husbands or they would be stoned. An interesting early version of the Protestant ethic was represented by women who lived together as ascetics, as nuns, but were independent businesswomen who produced cloth. To sum up, to relegate the analysis of changing family forms to a secondary status leaves social interpretation not only incomplete, but distorted. Furthermore, to leave out women as women leaves out people. Hence, much of the dialectic that is involved in individual decision making is the stuff of social process. Such omission is conducive to mechanical determinism in the analysis of both pre-class and class society. And finally, the passing over as subsidiary of subjects concerning women not only distorts understanding, but becomes another stone in the wall of masculine resistance that moves women to reject Marxism as not relevant to their problems. As a result, the positive contribution Marxists should be making toward the women's movement is hampered. Marx indicated that the oppression of women in a society was the measure of its general oppression. One can add, the strength of women's involvement in a movement dedicated to opposing a social order is a measure of the movement's strength or weakness.